We are live, though I don't know if we've got many people listening yet since we had to switch the streams at the last moment. I am checking over here on LinkedIn to see if anybody's actually here. We're here for episode 2 of Privacy Overheard. I'm Jeff Jokish with Debbie Reynolds, the data diva, and Justin Daniels, the privacy and security lawyer. How do we name you, Justin?
A man with a certain set of skills.
I like that. Very good. Well, we're here to talk about anything and everything, but primarily the unfortunate shooting of the United Healthcare CEO. There's been 2 weeks now. Seems like a long time, but I don't think it's been that long. I'm not even sure what the date is. We'll have to look that up while we're talking here. But it's been a really roller coaster ride, I think, for the whole country, if not the world, with this event. Your thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I think, this is a story I think would be talked about for many years, almost like, John Benet Ramsey or the Menendez brothers. I think it just has all those different elements and it plugs into kind of a lot of different things like, surveillance, classism, the little guy versus the big guy, kind of the vigilantiness, the things things that are not great about being connected all the time, I guess. And then also I think this situation, just to go back a bit, I know that we're talking about kind of this particular incident and kind of things around it, but United Health had been in the news this year for a lot of things that weren't great. They had a huge cyber breach. There were some other rumblings about some other things that were happening, possibly. I don't know, insider trading talk. I don't know how far that went, but I think some of the things that have happened really underscore for me some of the reasons why cybersecurity and privacy are very important.
Yeah, very definitely. You want to weigh in there, Justin?
I think the only thing I wanted to add, and this is kind of ancillary to what's come out of this, is there's also been talk around how artificial intelligence can be deployed to make decisions about what healthcare is covered, what prior authorizations are approved. And what strikes me is how healthcare puts into really sharp focus how you really need to be thoughtful when you're going to start to bring to bear a technology like artificial intelligence to start making decisions that could determine whether or not somebody gets life-saving or life-altering healthcare.
Yeah, I think the way we understand it, at least in the news coverage, it seemed to me, right? I don't know exactly how they're processing information, right? But it seemed to me that the public knowledge of United Healthcare system is that they were analyzing a bunch of information and essentially making a top line decision to deny coverage for a bunch of treatments just as a base decision, right? Not even necessarily. I mean, maybe they're making some analysis of that data, but putting a very strict bar on that information and saying we're just mostly going to deny these things because we know that a lot of people aren't going to challenge those decisions, right? And that's a business decision, right? Not necessarily a medical decision in a lot of people's minds, right? I guess you could probably challenge that in a couple different ways, right? But that's not even really looking at the way I would think about AI in terms of let's really analyze the illness and see what we could do for somebody, right? Which is, I think, the real benefits of what AI might be able to do.
Yeah, right. It can. So I say AI is machete. It's not a scalpel, right? So if you're looking for something that's more nuanced that requires more judgment, AI is not the right tool for that. So as you say, I would imagine companies trying to use AI to really help humans make better decisions as opposed to making these, sharp decisions where AI doesn't have a brain, can't do nuance at all, really. That's not really what it's there for. So, and also, I think companies that are trying to build AI that's a barrier between them and their customer, that's just not the right use either.
I think there's another thing too, right? Is they have no idea what the parameters that United Healthcare is using to make those deny decisions. But I think it was reported in the news that something like 44% or 46% were getting denied. I mean, maybe it's based upon what the medical procedure is. I assume that's probably what it was, right? But imagine if somebody was really devious, and they were actually denying it based upon somebody's ability to pay, or somebody's propensity to not dispute the charge, right? Because they can make those calculations pretty easily too, right? If they know that somebody is never going to dispute the charge, just deny it, right? That would be a pretty wise business decision, if completely amoral.
Yeah, it's troubling, right? I am concerned that a lot of you know because AI is not human, AI is not a person, AI doesn't have a brain, call it like a headless type of technology. I don't think artificial intelligence should be a substitute for human judgment. So I think in some of these cases, there may be frustration from clinicians or doctors where they feel like their advice or their recommendation isn't being considered in a way where you have AI as making kind of a business decision as opposed to a health or medical decision. So I guess that's a challenge for healthcare overall in figuring out how they want to be able to use these technologies in how they manage people's care.
Hey, I want to add something there. I know Justin wants to talk here because he's got a lot to add. Let me add one more thing here, right? When we put all this data about a patient and their treatment and all their information, assuming you just throw all that information into a black box and tell the AI to optimize for that decision, right? What pieces of information is it using? Is it using the treatment information, or the customer propensity to respond, right? Information you don't necessarily know, right? Especially if you're not paying attention to that. So what data points is it using to make those decisions? That's a little scary, right? So
Well, I think this goes to what I've read, what the two of you talk about all the time. And that is, when we're talking about this AI tool and how it makes these determinations, the question becomes, when did they get in the room to say, okay, what's the risk of this AI tool looking at regulatory, transparency, explainability, and how are we documenting how we're thinking about this and making these decisions? Because when I see stuff that gets rolled out this quickly, my first question is, when did they have these detailed discussions to talk about just some of the things we've brought up in the last 9 minutes that we've been on this conversation? I tend to think it's full steam, let's get to market. If something comes up, we'll deal with it then, and not hew to the kinds of practices that I see, Jeff, that you write about. Debbie, you certainly write about. I mentioned them as well. And I think what's so poignant about all of this is the reactions that we've seen on LinkedIn or just in society in general about what their view is of how awful the murder of the CEO was, because they feel like no one cares about these decisions that are getting made that are impacting my health or the health of a loved one. And it just has really brought this really nasty undercurrent to the surface. And it's just, to me, another social ramification of what we're doing in healthcare, and how can technology either help lessen it or turbocharge it and make it worse. I don't know, Debbie, Jeff, what have you been thinking about when you read all of these things we're seeing on LinkedIn or elsewhere about a lot of people think there's justification for what was done?
Yeah, I'll chime in. Actually, let me go back. I'm gonna go back to the cyber breach with United Health. So that was a huge breach. It was a huge problem because, and I actually had someone that I know that was personally affected by that, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the impact that it had. So there were people, because of that breach, they had to shut a lot of things down. There were doctors, they had to cancel surgeries. There were medical people that weren't getting paid. There were people that I know personally that weren't able to get, life, medication for chronic illnesses as a result of that cyber breach. And to me, that, it shouldn't be that way. I think systems, we pretend like technology has always been there. So I remember when you used to have a computer to set a surgery or to get a medication. So the fact that we have a lack of resilience, I think, especially around something in healthcare, is truly disturbing to me. So I think all of this kind of snowballs together in a way, going up to, maybe this incident. But I think, we need to have a rethink, especially as we know that these technologies that we're using or not using in certain ways do have, can have detrimental impacts on humans.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a sort of amazing how resonant this story has been with so many people. I mean, I didn't realize. Well, I mean, I was somehow swept up in the United Healthcare breach as well. I didn't even think I actually used United Healthcare, but somehow my data was in there, which is pretty scary. I guess maybe a lot of people were. But when the shooting actually happened, a couple days in, I reshared somebody's post and just made some comment about motives of the shooter. Um, and I didn't think much about the post, but it ended up getting like 20,000 views, right? And it was just a quick little missive post that I made. But people are angry on both sides of this, both that that it's sort of dismissive of the killing of somebody, and that the other direction, right? That maybe this guy had it coming, you know, um, or that yeah, I mean that we're not doing anything about the healthcare problem. Um, and people in my stream saying, "Hey, why are you sharing this picture of this shirtless kid? We're not even sure he did it, right? You're violating his privacy." So there are, I guess there are legitimate questions here too about, what are the rights of the accused? Should we be, sharing information of people that are accused of crimes? And, what about the families? And, we've got so many issues of privacy when we start to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I was more concerned not about the shooter, but it was widely reported about the person who worked at McDonald's that called,
Yeah.
law enforcement, and like how many people work at McDonald's in Altoona. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
so it's very easy to know who that person is. And I felt like the press should have been better about, masking the identity of that person, even though you didn't actually say their name. Like, that's enough information, right, to be able to target that person, for whatever reason. So, I would have liked them to say some undisclosed person gave us a tip and that's it, as opposed to, this person, worked at this place in this town and they said this and they did that. And so to me, that creates a risk for that person or for those people, one way or another, that I think that the press hadn't really, for them, maybe in the maybe 50 years ago, they could say that and it wouldn't be a big deal. But now with the interconnectedness of everything, people being able to really find out information about people, that creates risk for that person or those people.
Yeah, that individual's been doxxed, right? I mean, his life has changed. The trajectory of it's changed. I mean, he's going to have a hard time probably finding a job, or at least he's going to be targeted by some people, right, for what he did. The McDonald's is getting a lot of hate because I don't know why, right? um, there's also, I thought this is interesting when they were looking for the shooter. A lot of online detectives usually jump into these searches, right? People on TikTok, people on Twitter and stuff, they'll just like donate their time to try to find people. Not so much with this guy. They essentially said, "No, I'm not going to help," um, which is sort of interesting. Online open source intelligence people, um, which obviously that was sort of my first indication that this was maybe a little bit of a different situation. But it also sort of points to the fact that anybody can be found. Somebody said that you think they're going to find this guy, and I said, I don't think there's any chance that he's not going to be found in a few days because there's just so many people looking for him. There's so much data out there, right, about anybody. Um, and it started this whole thing with now every CEO in the world is starting to worry about their digital footprints. And
Yeah.
apparently they should, because the law enforcement's really worried about copycats. With
Yeah.
many people, you saw that statistic of, with that survey, about 40% of young people thought that maybe this was a justified killing, or I don't think that was the exact word they used, but something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to, and I definitely want Justin to hop in here. And this is something I've been saying for many, many years. Executives are some of the weakest links within organizations around cybersecurity, and so again, I feel like this is a snowball incident. So let's just take it. This is what I see and what happens, right? And so, an executive works at a big company. It's been there for many years, rises up through the ranks, possibly has a lot of permissions to stuff that maybe he shouldn't have access to. A lot of times, these executives, they don't want to go to training about cybersecurity. They don't want to use secure passwords. So these are the ABC 1 2 3 group. They don't really take it as seriously as they need to. A lot of times, let's say they have assistants and things, they don't know what they should or shouldn't share about maybe the whereabouts or the dealings, or even bits of information that can make someone more targetable. So I think there's just a huge change that needs to happen in terms of executives and how they deal with kind of their cyber issues. Because I feel like, even a lot of these breaches happen because they target people who have a lot of access, right? And possibly not a lot of knowledge, or they're not as close to the issues, but they have a lot of access and a lot of information. And then my question here in this particular situation, I'm curious, it hasn't come out yet. We know that there's a lot of data about people just out there in the wild, right? And I know taking someone's picture off of a corporate website is like a tactic, and that's just a very minor thing that you can do. But I wonder how this person was able to get the information that this person would be walking on that street at that time of day. You know what I'm saying? So to me, I think maybe there's some social engineering that may have happened there. Because I mean, like, so what? He go to an investor meeting and he was going to talk. He did it every year, right? But how did he know? I've been to the Hilton. You can get in and out of the Hilton many different ways. Like, how did he know he was on that street at that time? So I'm curious about that, and maybe there were some clues, maybe there was some information that was spilled about him, and what he was doing and his whereabouts that we don't know yet. But I think that this is like a huge problem within corporations in terms of the power of people within these corporations at these higher ranks. A lot of times they don't want to do the things that are necessary to protect themselves and the company in terms of like cyber, and it could create a risk, a harm to them personally.
Yep.
Debbie, I listen to what you say, and a perverse thought comes into my mind. United Healthcare is a publicly traded company. And so, building on what you said, what's to stop an enterprising class action lawyer from saying, you know what, we're going to sue the company for what happened to the executive, because that executive, in our view, was key to the company, and the stock prices dropped because you didn't adequately protect them from a cybersecurity and physical standpoint. and the company should be held liable in a derivative action for that.
I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. Right? Because I think the guy had a security detail and they weren't with
Yeah.
him. I could see that. I could see that. I could see, maybe the family of the person suing
Yeah.
the company for that. Absolutely.
Just, I guess one of the things that comes to my mind as we've talked about this is how you see people react on social media. It's almost like this interconnectedness has a ironic consequence, which is we lose our ability to relate to each other. Because I think if we were in a room with those people who responded to your post, Jeff, where I saw some of the things that you've written, Debbie, I don't think you see the level of emotion and vitriol because you're in a room. You can see their face. You can size them up. And to me, that's just seems to be a consequence. We now live in a time where our connection to each other seems to be closer, but on closer inspection, I can hide behind a computer screen and rant and rave. And so these issues become even more polarizing. But if you ask me, I think what this really comes down to is I know personally when I've had to go through all this approval process and call and get put on hold and it takes an hour or two, you get frustrated. Well, what if they said, hey, I read an article where they denied care to someone who was dealing with leukemia because they thought she was too sick to have the treatment and they were shamed. And by the time they said, okay, it was too late for the person. I could, as a rational human being, I could see how that kind of thing might drive someone to take very drastic action because it's such
Yeah.
a big deal.
Exactly. There was a woman who, I don't know whose post she had put this information on. Maybe it's on one of Jeff's posts, but she was saying that her grandmother needed some type of treatment. It was very expensive, and they basically wanted her to, she had to sell her house basically in order to pay for this treatment. And she was like, this house has been there in their family for 100 years. They couldn't get the insurance to cover certain things, and so people are literally unfortunately having to get bankrupt. And we've seen this over many years, and this is very different in the US because we don't have universal health care. So I think that's very different. But then also one of the risks that we have in the US that other countries don't have who have universal health care is that there's a lot of data about you that has to get exchanged or moved around, like you change jobs or different things, right? So all those data moves create more risk for people too. But then also I think people are Justin said, there is a lot of frustration in the US around healthcare. We spend the most, I think, internationally, globally on healthcare. We have some of the worst outcomes, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's strange. We have the best health care, but the health outcomes are not what we expect, right? So that's the disconnect that people are starting to wake up to. Just because you have the best tech and the best doctors doesn't mean we're getting the best outcomes.
And then to me, the other thing that comes up in the aftermath of all this is obviously they eventually brought in a suspect, but the first few days there was challenges in doing that with police investigative work. And to me, it brings up the issue of, I know we've all written about facial recognition, and to me, when you see something that happens like this, the public policy, especially with things that happen in schools, we saw what happened in Wisconsin this week, yet another example. It's facial recognitions in cameras, to me, it's inevitable. And to me, what concerns me is we're going to roll things out like this. And I think this AI is another example of it without really thinking through what the unintended consequences are, because for-profit companies aren't built to do that. They're built to create innovative products that produce a profit, but they don't really think about what are these social and other consequences. Social media is another great example. And I'm just curious as to, how do you two react both as people who are data privacy professionals, but also, if that would help protect your loved ones in schools or help catch criminals, where do both of you come out and how you think about balancing those two competing interests?
I'm not in favor of like having facial recognition all over the place. I mean, I think it can be put in some public places, but I mean, I don't know. I've got problems with that. But here's one thing that I can add here, and I'm sure Debbie has an even stronger view on that. But and I'll give her a minute to speak in a sec. But here's something. There's so much data that's collected about us all over the place, right? And the government has some of that data, but what people don't realize is that all of these commercial databases of information, that this massive amount of information, law enforcement doesn't have access to hardly any of it. Um, that's a good thing, I guess, right? But when we suspect that that all these transactions we have, that all of it's going directly to the FBI or to the police departments, they don't have easy access to most of it. Um, they can get it sometimes, right? But it usually is a harder process for them to get access to a lot of location data to be able to track down a person, or facial recognition data to be able to track down a person. That's why sometimes they look sort of clueless, because they don't have access to the data, and they don't have people that know how to go out and find people. That's why a TikToker, might be able to find somebody easier than a police department. It's sort of crazy. I sort of like it, but I also think it's sort of dumb, right? I mean, we want our law enforcement to be able to catch bad guys.
Yeah, but let's take this scenario and pretend like we have facial recognition. So let's say there was facial recognition. Who would be in the database? Possibly usual suspects, right? People, known criminals or known people in that area that had committed crimes. Guess who's not going to be in that database? Someone who hadn't committed a crime. He was not a criminal until he shot someone, right? They are not looking for Ivy League educated person from a wealthy family in a facial recognition system, right? The facial recognition systems, it wouldn't be everyone in New York or everyone who happens to be in New York. That's like a huge, that just wouldn't be, um, the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, right? For that type of thing to happen. Also, there are a lot of false identifications of people in facial recognition systems. So I don't know if that would be helpful at all in this particular situation. But I think is really telling that this case, even though facial recognition wasn't used, in that way, basically that the photo that was circulated was enough for someone, a human, to actually pick up the phone and call law enforcement and say, hey, here's this guy, right? So I think we can't all rely on, or I know a lot of people who are in the facial recognition business, and they think it's a boon for them that they can, have people do these systems. But, in this case, I don't think it would have mattered. I don't think it would have made a difference at all. It was almost like Gattaca, right? So remember Gattaca is like, okay, we think someone in this high place was murdered in the movie, and what they did was look at all the people who are kind of the lower rung of society, because they assume like no one in the upper echelon would have ever done this crime. So let's look at people who are kind of like at the lower rungs of society. So to me, almost is, there's a parallel there when you think about like facial recognition in this type of scenario.
Well, Debbie and Jeff, I guess where I'm going to bring a little bit of a different perspective is I've done work for municipalities, and there are things out there like, for example, Flock Safety has digital license plate technology where they can read a license plate and the car is registered to someone who's been wanted for some type of crime. It augments the police. You have Clearview AI that literally goes and scrapes the internet of everybody's picture, and law enforcement have a subscription and access that. And so I guess where I'm concerned is, to me, with where technology is and things that are out there now, the leap to getting to facial recognition, because you see that in China already, in other totalitarian states, the clamor for public safety makes it a pretty quick leap to what these technologies may do to be supplied and what those ramifications might be on privacy, because it's interesting how you see privacy and whatnot come up here in very different contexts. The privacy of the person at McDonald's we talked about. We talked about potential privacy of cameras when you're trying to catch a criminal. Privacy of a CEO about where they might be because someone's trying to attack. You see privacy come up on different contexts where the answer could be very different depending on the context, which makes this, what we all do really fascinating. I think we have a comment in our chat.
Yeah. What's the question?
Yes. It says, I think this guy wanted to be caught. He was at McDonald's with a manifesto.
Well, that was actually the point I made when I posted that comment on LinkedIn a few, maybe a week ago, right? That maybe he wanted to be caught, right?
Yeah.
Seemed pretty likely.
I thought so. I'm sure he had a passport. He could have gotten out of the country and did something else. Yeah, I think he probably did want to get caught, actually.
But I'm not sure it's like if it's a get caught, don't get caught kind of thing. Maybe he didn't really want to spend the rest of his life in prison, But I don't think the guy is probably completely sane or in his right mind if he's doing these kinds of things.
I think I was surprised. I think I was a bit surprised because I think when that incident happened, I guess you automatically think of like movies, right? Some like conspiratorial, shadow, blah 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 is gonna happen. So the fact that this is kind of like a lone wolf type of person that has his own ideology, not even enough to raise anyone's curiosity, even on social media, right? So he wasn't like one of these crazy people on Twitter, saying these outrageous things, even though he had read something about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber and stuff like that. But that isn't enough to raise suspicion about someone's behavior, right? So, he made a huge leap from being interested or enamored with someone like the Unabomber, and then kind of doing this act. So I don't know what that thought process was, and I'm still like very curious to know how he knew that the guy would be walking to the Hilton. Like I would almost imagine if you were speaking at the Hilton, you would like stay in the Hilton. I don't know. So it's just a lot of questions.
I definitely don't want to feed conspiracy theories, but I mean, it is awfully convenient that he has all the evidence on him when he's sitting there at a McDonald's, right? And they just walk in and arrest him, right? But I think that speaks more to his state of mind, right? That he either wanted to be caught or he thought he was invulnerable, right? And people that have those kinds of mindsets are probably one or the other, right? That's my thought anyway. It's not like, I don't think it was a government conspiracy or some sort of a setup or anything like that, right? I mean, I think he just either thought he was invulnerable and would never get caught, or he wanted to get caught.
Yeah, and this is another example of why AI doesn't work in these types of things. Again, it's not for nuance, not very good at kind of these lone wolf type things. It's better at maybe making a first cut of certain things of a known incident. So I tell people, the future will not be like the past. So if you're relying on systems that are making judgments or decisions or even speculations about things in the future based on the past, this will not have been a scenario that AI would have been able to catch, right? Because it's so small, and it's kind of very much an outlier to kind of the bigger corpus of the way people think about crime or criminality.
That's interesting because I know that I was doing a panel with the U.S. Secret Service, and they have a whole cyber fraud task force, and they've created an in-house AI tool that has been trained on all of their criminal investigatory data, and they use that for trying to do better and see patterns when they're dealing with criminals or ransomware gangs and things of that nature. Oh, I think we have some more questions in our chat. So any thoughts on PII released in a data breach and liability in EU and the US?
I mean, data breaches have pretty, strict laws across the 50 states. They're all different, right? But I don't know that there's necessarily any particular liability other than, California has a private right of action, right? I don't think anybody else does yet.
Private right of action for, I think, what? Exposure of unencrypted data.
Right.
Yes. I mean,
But, yeah.
Yeah, and health again, because we are transmitting data. So the more you transmit data, the more data moves, the more risk that you have, right? So in countries where this data, especially health, isn't really moving a whole lot, those risks are lower because they're sharing less. So I think in the US, we probably have more cyber risk because there's probably more, especially in health, more data being moved around in that case. But I mean, there in all these jurisdictions, there is liability for breaches that happen or unauthorized access for sure.
I mean,
So,
I'm thinking if this is some kind of case against United Healthcare, Debbie, I'd be thinking along the lines of negligence in protecting the CEO, negligence around, those kinds of things, and then you can sidestep all of this. I mean, obviously there are multiple counts, but I think another thing we're really thinking about here is, well, what is now physical kinds of cyber risk around key employees of company, and then how do you protect that? There's physical security, but also, to your point, Debbie, how did this person get such detailed information as to where this person would be at exactly that time? I don't know. Did they follow them around? But maybe that's one of the ramifications. And I guess the other one is if CEOs are seeing this, how are they thinking about, well, if I need to be worried about my own personal data, what does that mean for all of the data of the customers that I'm collecting?
right. One thing that I mentioned a few times is that, when we do a lot of cybersecurity training for employees, it it seems to help a bit, but there's sort of a ceiling on how much you can train employees on cybersecurity, right? Before it just sort of washes off them. They they don't listen any longer, in my opinion. But one thing that there's been some research on, and if you actually train employees on privacy, it makes your cybersecurity better because they start to understand why they're doing the cybersecurity stuff, right? That there's actually a reason for the cybersecurity because it actually affects people like them, right? They can understand and sort of internalize, right, the need for cybersecurity because they're actually protecting the privacy of clients, right, of customers, of employees, of themselves, right, and so they can actually understand that and apply it, right? It's sort of like understanding the commander's intent if you understand like sort of military tactics. Um, but I think that's pretty valuable, and I think we should be doing more of that. And so maybe if we're starting to think about training people to protect their own data, they'll start to understand that they need to protect the client's data as well.
I love that. I love that. I did a framework called safety by design privacy framework. And so the idea is companies that make these technologies and do all this tracking and tracing and different things, really looking at a design level in order to protect people. Because we're seeing, just with this particular situation, because there's so much information in digital spaces about people, it does create a harm. It does create a risk to people. Maybe not to that particular extent. But it can be harmful, right? A lot of people, some of this tech, I call it like stalker tech, right? Where these applications or this data is really for someone who's really interested in doing tracking or maybe want to do something harmful to someone. The tools, even though they may not um, be developed in that way, they're really just creating more harm for the person. So the example I like to give is that Stavia, I can't remember, a Strava app,
So,
the running app, where actually because of that app, I think that's one of the reasons why that executive order came out about data brokers not sending data overseas to countries of concern, because they're like, we have people on military bases that are using this app, and now they're being targeted. Now their families are being targeted because those apps track people's location. And what they do is they try to crowdsource or share that information. And from the app maker's perspective, they were just thinking, oh, this would be cool. These people run together and maybe they, can share information about routes. What they're not thinking about is what someone with a bad motive can do when you're tracking someone's exact location, especially if they're doing sensitive work on a military base or different things. But I agree with Jeff. I'm hoping that more focus on how this can help an individual can help bolster the cyber and privacy within companies, where I feel like cyber seems so distant to people, where privacy, I think people have their own personal opinion about that.
yeah. Well, one thing to remember, I hope these CEOs or C-suite executives remember this, right? That they really have to protect wider than just themselves. Because if an attacker is going to go after them to try to find their information, if they can't get to you directly, the way they find out about you is to go to your circle of trust, the people around you, whether that's your wife, your kids, your business partner, another executive in the same suite, your secretary, your lawyer, right? Because those people have all that information about you as well. And so if they can penetrate those people because their information's all over the place, it's usually a way to get to you.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Jeff, because now when I've been doing tabletop exercise simulating a cyber attack, one of the injections that I've started to include is something where the people who want the ransom, the threat actor, make cryptic remarks about where the executive's wife might be, his kids might be, because they've gone on social media and found that. And when you inject that into a situation and the CEOs never practice it, I mean, they're like, well, how did you know that? Well, it's really easy. It's just open source, and they're making threats because they know where your family is going to be. And then that puts an enormous amount of pressure under the CEO to, pay an exorbitant amount. But one thing I wanted to ask, and, Jeff, want to hear your opinion, but specifically because Debbie, you and I have had this conversation many times, is you talked about your framework for safety design. And one of the things that we've all discussed that I bring up a lot is, well, regulation in a way is kind of codified incentives or disincentives to do stuff. And so when you see something like this, what are your thoughts around what can we do to put in legally recognized incentives? So maybe things like this have to get thought about, because I think, Jeff, if you or Debbie or myself were part of that team talking to Strava or talking about this AI deployment with patient care, I think some of these questions start to get asked. And if there's some incentives in place, like regulation that says, hey, you have to be able to document your decision, you have to be able to explain why this risk was acceptable, then at least you get a window into what they were or weren't thinking, instead of what you have now where you're not really sure. And, the regulatory framework is it's nascent, it's forming. So love to hear what you both think about that.
Yeah, I think we need to do something about that. I was just thinking as you started talking about that, I was thinking about, actually tactics of like how I would go and get somebody's phone number, because we do that all the time. And we do that through, piecing together information from different sources of data that apps and services leak, right? I mean, there are different APIs from different services. So, I can get maybe a list of different potential phone numbers that you use, Justin, and then I can hit a couple different apps, and some of those apps might say, oh, hey, the first couple of numbers from his phone number is this, right? And I can use another app API, and it'll say the last two digits of the number he signed up with are these two numbers. And based upon a couple of different pieces of information, I can figure out like, okay, well, of these three numbers that might be his, that this is the one here because it ends in 05, right? So that's the one that's probably his number. And so now, with just a little bit of research, I know what your number is, and that's probably the one you're using right now.
Debbie, what do you think? And then maybe we can hit answering some questions. We got some people are being chatty in the chat room. So we need to
Very
recognize
cool. Well, I will just say, technology is a double-edged sword, right? So when companies are building these things, they're very good at figuring out how it benefits them. But they also have to think about how it benefits or doesn't benefit the human, right? So that's the part that we're missing in terms of this. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if regulation is the answer, but I think there has to be more thinking about the security of people with all the data that people collect. It can't just be, so a lot of this data collection was supposed to be quote unquote for advertising, right? But we're seeing companies buy this data, use it for risk modeling and all types of things that aren't transparent to people, and they are creating harms. And so I think healthcare is one of those examples where, data about you that maybe you don't know about that's being used in some way could possibly harm you. So that lack of transparency and also that lack of understanding of the potential harm that you put someone in when you're developing a tool needs to be part of the conversation, not just about the benefits of the company.
The Texas data privacy law and their definition of a data broker is a little different than other stuff. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this exactly, right? But we talk about like people who sell your data, right? And how that's sort of the antithesis of the problem, right? But it's really more than that, right? I mean, people can just collect your data whenever they want, right? Whatever they want, right? And they can transfer your data to pretty much whoever they want. And they can process your data in any way they want, right? And all those things sound sort of benign until you realize what they actually mean, right? I mean, collect any piece of data they want about me and put it into a big profile. I mean, it doesn't sound so bad until you think that, some company's got 40,000 pieces of data about you in a big profile, and they can do whatever they want with it. Right? I mean, even if they don't sell it, right, they can use that information to know a lot about you and license that or let people access it or infer things about you and use it in other ways, even if they're not selling it outright. That's really damn powerful. It's like, are they the law enforcement or are they sort of omniscient and using that kind of power for what, right? If it's not just advertising, imagine all the other things they could be doing with that.
That's very true. Maybe while we have a little more time, we can try to answer a couple of our chatty questions, which one was, do you think this will potentially change the court's view on real versus theoretical harm related to privacy data breaches regarding whether or not the plaintiffs even have standing? It is my understanding that many courts refuse to recognize theoretical or future harm.
That's already changing. I think about half the courts around the country. I'm blanking on what you call the regional courts. Have actually sort of recognized future harm, right? I think they're sort of going against Spokio, and eventually the Supreme Court's going to have to weigh in on it. I may have that a little bit wrong, but they've sort of gone against everything has to be concrete and particularized in terms of like a data breach, that there is at least some level of ability to get standing for a data breach that is not a I guess not a specific financial harm that you've occurred right now already, right? That there's a future harm or risk of harm that you're going to be a victim of identity theft in the future. And if that risk is great enough, that's enough to get a judgment.
And I'll just add quickly, the BIPA law in Illinois, biometric information privacy law, one of my favorites. It's very short, a couple pages. Most hated law in the U.S. But one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons why some companies really hate it, is because the harm is the fact that someone's biometrics can be breached, right? So it's not that something bad happened because it was breached. The harm is that it can be breached, right? So I'm hoping to see more in that realm, right? So we don't want to have to see people be hurt or harmed or killed before there's some legal remedy that can help them.
It's interesting you mentioned BIPA, Debbie, because it's really the judicial interpretation of that law that has given it its scope. If you just read the law without understanding some of the decisions courts have made behind it, it wouldn't easily come to some of the conclusions that are necessary under that law.
I agree.
Yep. I think another question we had was about the standard of care of what really is gross negligence, around one of these situations. And honestly, I think a good place to start with that, and I've written about this, is the CrowdStrike Delta situation where CrowdStrike pushed their software and there was ramifications to Delta, and the contract had the gross negligence standard, which is a pretty high standard. The way I try to unpack this for non-legal folks is I use the football analogy. The difference between negligence and gross negligence is the difference between getting your ball beyond the 50-yard line versus getting into the red zone, which is the 20-yard line. That standard is significantly different. And usually that gets applied where courts, if it gets to litigation, use the facts, and in light of that standard, they determine whether or not it's been met or not. But the key is, so many vendor contracts or contracts start with gross negligence as your standard because pleading just basic negligence in a court case is pretty easy to do. And that then creates more opportunity for litigation. But as to what a standard of gross negligence would be, I don't know. I guess you could ask the three of us if United Healthcare was negligent in how it acted that led to what happened to its CEO.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a cyber tie there.
Yeah.
I definitely do, right? So yeah, I would love to hear more about how all this stuff came to be, but I think it is related to cyber security.
Yes, it's interesting how cybersecurity and privacy are an overlay for so many different areas and technologies, and yet, people think about implementing a technology, but they don't think about the privacy, the security, and I don't know if this will change things. I'd like to think there'd be something, but everyone has such a short attention span. In another few days, it's the holidays, and then they're on to the next thing. Because I find it ironic when I read stories about Mark Zuckerberg puts up these high privacy walls, yet he's built an empire on a company that collects your data come hell or high water.
Yeah, there's definitely a privacy cast system that's developing here, and to me that's a bit troubling, right? So I think everyone should have privacy as a right, but it's hard to have that when you don't have the tools to protect your privacy or protect yourself.
Well, I guess, Debbie, the other question I would have is, should it be the individual who should have to read all these notices and figure it out for themselves, or do we as a society have to have a debate and then codify into law what that is and make sure the companies just do it? Like, for example, I think you could solve a lot of problems tomorrow if you passed a law that said you must create apps or iOS environments that automatically have maximum privacy settings. You could have legislation like that. It won't happen because they'll say, oh, well, all the business and whatever. But those are areas where you can give incentives or disincentives to do different things. So I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
Apple kind of did that with app transparency. So it wasn't a law, but it does have, this has international implications, right? So unfortunately, it's like we as consumers without laws or regulation, we have to rely on the good graces of a company that really wants to do something to help the consumer, where it may not be something that a company would intrinsically do, maybe not in their ethos to do.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts? Because I know we're about to wrap up. Jeff, you want to start us off?
Yeah. I think this was a pivotal event. I think it sort of changes things in how we think, maybe about healthcare, certainly about data privacy. I think it gives the world a lot to think about in terms of cybersecurity. I don't know if it's going to change a lot of CEO behavior, but I suspect it will. And certainly they're going to think more about their digital footprint. Whether they actually go out there and delete it, I guess that remains to be seen. But to Debbie's point, I think we do need, maybe your point too, I think we do need a much easier way for everybody to be able to have more privacy, not just executives, because it's expensive to go out and delete your digital footprint. I mean, you can do some consumer level things, but if you really want to delete the harder stuff and all of the stuff, it's not easy. I do that for a lot of clients, and it's hard.
Yeah.
It's
I guess
hard to
I
find it
guess
all.
my wish is to have less data out there, so then you don't have to do that, right? So I think it's a multi-layered or multi-pronged approach. Obviously, there's too much data out there about existing people who would need that type of service, but I would love for brands to be able to do this more proactively, so that they're building tools that aren't creating a potential future harm for someone.
Yeah, agreed.
I guess I'm just going to end by saying I think this whole situation and its aftermath has really brought to the forefront the intersection between technology, kind of social views around our healthcare system, and, again, how we relate to each other. And my thought around this is this should be a good cautionary data point if we're really listening as to what's going to happen as we start to deploy more of this AI technology, where very important decisions, from whether or not Jeff and Debbie get their credit approved versus a healthcare decision versus does Jeff's niece get into college? And what does that mean when machines are making this decision? Because we've now seen in healthcare, it's a very fundamental right that people take, fundamental decision that people take very seriously. And this whole thing is brought to the forefront that there's a serious amount of frustration lurking just below the surface when it comes to how fundamental decisions about our lives get made.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way to say it, Justin.
I agree.
All right. Then I guess that's a good way to end.
Awesome.
All right.
This has been Privacy Overheard number 2. We'll be back for number 3 at some point in the new year. So
Thank you, gents.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.